Hello, welcome to episode 168 of the Book Binge, where this week we are covering something very exciting for me indeed. That is going to be The Murdered Sun by Christopher Ruocchio. Now, for those of you who don't know, this is not a new book in the Sun Eater saga, so don't be worried. This isn't like a book 7 review that's happening an entire year early or anything like that. The Murdered Sun is the original version of Empire of Silence before it met the gaze of an editor, or rather before it was affected by an editor, before it was expanded and workshopped to become the Empire of Silence that we know and love today. Now, one of the things that I think most people are going to have the most questions about with The Murdered Sun is how similar is it to Empire of Silence? And Christopher has, of course, talked about this one or two times on the channel before. The Murdered Sun is most especially similar to Empire of Silence, so far as the first act of the book goes, the Delos arc, we'll say. Most everything after that is quite different where plot is concerned, but there are a lot of similarities as well. Certain things, including things that I find familiar about Empire of Silence that I wasn't expecting to find to such a deep degree in The Murdered Sun that I did and was very surprised about. So my reading of The Murdered Sun went quite well, a lot better than I anticipated, and it has so much DNA from Empire of Silence that was expanded upon, but also stuff that is like a little bit different in an exciting new kind of way that, you know, it's just really exciting to talk about. I already mentioned the Delos stuff is largely the same. There are other things that are very different. Plenty of the plot itself is very different, but there are some of those things that, despite being different, are still recognizable. And then there's some other things that you will recognize, but is kind of like scrunched up into a much shorter time period. Generally, The Murdered Sun is shockingly familiar, even beyond the Delos section, and this was so apparent to me that if I were adapting Empire of Silence, I would genuinely take a handful of cues from The Murdered Sun. That's not to say that I would change the story of Empire of Silence to be The Murdered Sun. I would absolutely not do that personally, but there are a couple of things that I think would be fun to use as Easter eggs from this one, and like a couple minor things, especially from the Delos arc, that I think would be fun to take from The Murdered Sun as opposed to Empire of Silence, just to see if anybody would recognize it as having been from something different, despite them being very similar. All of that being said, let's actually talk about the content of the book itself, and let me tell you about what I thought was good about The Murdered Sun, stuff that I think makes it worth reading even if you have read the series, and especially if you are a big fan of the series. Hadrian, of course, is a standout. Now, if you were one of those people who doesn't really like Hadrian in Empire of Silence, well, Murdered Sun's not going to change your mind. He's more or less the same character. He's very familiar. He's a little darker too, but he is close enough to the same character, going on close enough to the same arc, that if your primary complaint or primary hesitancy with Empire of Silence or Sun Eater is Hadrian himself in those first couple books, well, The Murdered Sun isn't going to change your mind, and maybe you won't find too much of worth in this one beyond that, because this one definitely has a lot more of Hadrian in it, because there's a lot less of other stuff in it. Obviously, Empire of Silence has plenty of Hadrian in it, but like, in terms of a ratio, Empire of Silence also has a lot of other stuff going on that The Murdered Sun just kind of doesn't, we'll say. And I also mentioned that Hadrian has a very similar journey, very similar arc, very similar trajectory. Even certain different decisions might surprise you. Certain different decisions that Hadrian makes in this one compared to the Hadrian that we would recognize from, say, Empire of Silence is different enough that you might be a little bit surprised by some of the things that he does, some of the ways that he even thinks in certain regards. It's kind of strange how he's like the same character, but just different enough in very minute things that, like, it's just cool to me. One of the other great aspects of The Murdered Sun is the villains, where I think Empire of Silence has a couple, like, you know, like token villains that aren't even really like villains of sorts. They're just like sort of antagonists. There's, I think, one super notable villain or antagonist in Empire of Silence. That antagonist is actually pretty similar to an antagonist here, while also being very, very different, and one that you would think is going to be like share absolutely no similarities, but kind of does. I can't really say anything about the character or even really name which character that is, because if I do, it gives away everything that I'm praising about the fact that this exists in The Murdered Sun, or the way that it exists in Murdered Sun. This plotline literally is so similar that, like, this plotline is so surprising that like after meeting this version of the character, I was like, okay, yeah, whatever, like they'll go on separate trajectory, it's fine. And then they were like kind of out of the story, so I didn't expect anything to come of it. But then like shares the exact same conclusion as they do in Empire of Silence, and it was really cool to see, and was frankly one of the best parts of The Murdered Sun, was a specific scene regarding that one character that I'm choosing not to name, because if I name it, just makes it way too obvious what's going to happen with them. Like, I'm sure if you've read Empire of Silence, or if you're really into it, you could probably guess, but like I'm not going to lay it out for you explicitly. There's also a couple new characters in this one of those being Lydia. That's the only name I'm going to give, who is very well realized despite the cold distance, and one that I actually kind of wish we could see more of in the main Sun Eater series. Of course we can't, and like that character has probably evolved and kind of been, replaced in some sense, I guess, by some of the other characters, or has had pieces taken from her and put into other characters in certain ways. And like I could see a little bit of her in certain other characters in the series as it currently exists, but like Lydia I found very compelling in this one despite relatively short page time. They're very familiar, but I would say the Sealson are much less polished versions of themselves in this version of the story. It was very fascinating to read the Sealson and reading Hadrian's encounters with the Sealson, because like, yeah, you can see exactly what the final act of Empire of Silence is doing with them, but you can also see just how much Christopher grew that concept and really polished it up. Like I said before, just really, really, really cool. The pacing of The Murdered Sun is also surprisingly good. It is much quicker than Empire of Silence on account of it being much shorter. That could be a good thing, that could be a bad thing, depending on who you are. I am somebody who says and thinks that the pacing of Empire of Silence is one of the worst things about that book. It's not like it's actively bad pacing, but it is easily the worst pacing of the entire series, or of any individual book or story in the series. And a lot of that is on account of the expansion and the name of the winding of it, the major changes that happened because of that on account of the first editor. The Murdered Sun is a much shorter book and therefore doesn't suffer from as many of those pacing problems. It does have some, question marks that might be raised by some of the pacing decisions in it, because there's like some of the stuff that you see happen in Empire of Silence just happens much more condensed and quickly, or at least their equivalent happens much more condensed and quickly in The Murdered Sun. That might like have you like, whoa, Christopher, you're going way too fast with this specific stuff. Like, this is faster than this specific arc should be going. But that's really only our familiarity with Empire of Silence talking, as opposed to the actual pacing of the book itself being a problem. That said, that pacing did actually make The Murdered Sun very easy to read quickly. It's missing some of the meat, but it's also missing some of the fat as well. So like, you're getting a much more condensed version of the story that's a little bit different, but covers some of the same thematic or idealistic ground. If you ever wondered how Sun Eater could have ever been just 5 books, let alone just 4 books, as it was going to be when, Christopher wrote The Murdered Sun, it was actually only planned to be 4, and then he kind of pitched it as 5. And then it became the 7 that it is. If you ever wondered how it could possibly be the case that it could be just 4 or 5 books, well, reading this one kind of makes it obvious, because a lot of the big things that happen in, like, say, Howling Dark, like, a lot of, like, the first half of that book probably would be very short if it were continued. Most of Demon in White would probably just not have, like, happened that way. It would have been much less, like, if I were to say the 4-book version of Sun Eater, I would say it would be like, obviously The Murdered Sun as it is, but then you have like a little bit of Howling Dark, mostly in the latter half, and like probably a little bit of the latter half of Demon in White in there, and that would be the 2nd book. And then you would have like the Kingdoms of Death, Ashes of Man, big stuff happening, and that would be the 3rd book. And then you would have like the back half of Disquiet Gods, and then obviously the major stuff in book 7, and like that would be the 4th book. Like, it would be impossible for Sun Eater to be that short as it currently exists and have all the stuff that we love about it. But yeah, like, you can kind of see where the series could have been that short by reading The Murdered Sun. But frankly, I'm glad we have the version of the series that we have, even if Empire of Silence is the weakest thing, in my opinion, that Christopher has written. And before we move on to the bad, I have one final thing I do want to praise about The Murdered Sun, that being the Easter eggs. Things that we know from the main series, just as a whole that you can kind of parse out and intuit from the Murdered Sun is just a really fun thing to experience. So things that like we know details about that are merely hinted at in the Murdered Sun, kind of the way that rereading Empire of Silence is fun for that reason. Even reading the Murdered Sun is fun because you can kind of see some of those things, and you can see how some of those things are a little different than they currently exist in the series, and that's just a whole lot of fun. The titling it an apocryphal, let's actually get the actual worded version of this. The apocryphal testament of Hadrian Marlowe is actually an apt description, because it is very similar to Empire of Silence in a lot of ways, but there are things just different enough that it's like, yeah, this might just be a false history written by some other random person. Who knows? It's very fun to look at it that way. But as for the bad, I will say that the prose is notably weaker through most of the story. I do think that the Delos section is very comparable, but of course that makes sense because the Delos section is largely the same between the Murdered Sun and Empire of Silence, and most of what was in Empire of Silence was kept kind of the way it is. There are plenty of moments of brilliance that just kind of strike throughout the novel that, really make the Murdered Sun shine, and where you can definitely tell where Christopher started to form some of that strong prose, but it is a decent bit weaker than even Empire of Silence was, and the prose along with the pacing are the two things about Empire of Silence that are the weakest about the entire series, in my opinion. The Murdered Sun is also not nearly as deep as the series we've come to know, as I briefly discussed, on account of it being so much shorter. I think that's not necessarily a bad thing, but like if you're, expecting this to be a very long book the way that all of the rest of these are, well, that's not exactly what this is going to be. It's a little bit shorter, it's a little bit more of a romp than it is a philosophical chew your food type of book. Certain things also aren't really given their due time to breathe. I think the second act is kind of rushed, but a lot of this is again kind of just in comparison to how the pacing of Empire of Silence is, the way that that book takes a while, and the way that that second act of sorts, the way that the whole Myrmidon section of Empire of Silence just like takes a long time to happen before he ends up in the palace with the Bataros. In the Murdered Sun, like the middle section that could be considered its equivalent to that second act is actually very short and doesn't really dig deep into a lot of that stuff. If one of your complaints about Sun Eater is that Christopher doesn't really use side characters to the full degree that he could, well, that is going to be arguably even worse in the Murdered Sun, just on account of the fact that it's so much shorter and he has so much less time to get through the main basic things that Empire of Silence got through. So if you imagine Empire of Silence being as short as this is, yeah, like character stuff is going to definitely take a back seat there, especially in that second act. The third act is also a tad bit strangely plotted in The Murdered Sun, but most of that is because we're used to the third and fourth act of Empire of Silence being the way that they are, and they're actually mostly just kind of combined in The Murdered Sun, and so like go back and forth in certain ways that like kind of feel weird when you're used to Empire of Silence. And when I say the third and fourth act of Empire of Silence, I think of Empire of Silence as 4 distinct acts versus 3 in most other books that I read, because it does kind of feel that way. You have the Delos section, you have the Streets and Myrmidon section being the second act, you have the being held captive, and then Caliga section being the sort of third act, and then the meeting the Sealson and the climax through the end being the fourth section. Those are like the 4 distinct acts of Empire of Silence. This version of the story has all 4 of those things, or an equivalent to all 4 of those things, but the third act is basically the third and fourth act as I just described them in The Murdered Sun, combined and paced a little bit differently. So there's a little bit of strange plotting here, but I don't think it's bad. It's just kind of different than Empire of Silence's. Speaking of the structure, for the ugly of The Murdered Sun, the structure is definitely a bit goofy because of the ways that I've just described. Seeing what does and doesn't make it from this into Empire of Silence is super fascinating, and the way that that structure especially is affected is really fun to read. If you're really into the series, the structure alone is worth almost reading The Murdered Sun for, in my opinion. Seeing what takes inspiration from this original version, where different aspects were separated and all that kind of stuff, is just a really interesting thing. Let's talk about it in terms of these acts as I've just described them. First act being primarily the Delos section. This is largely the same in The Murdered Sun as it is in the final version of Empire of Silence. It's a bit shorter, but it is more tightly paced in my opinion. There are some things missing though, like the way that Hadrian's mother is involved is not in The Murdered Sun, whereas whereas in Empire of Silence she is involved, and it's actually better that she is involved. But there are certain aspects to this that I almost prefer, such as when Hadrian leaves the Colossal fight that Crispin takes place in and gets jumped. That scene in The Murdered Sun I like better in The Murdered Sun than Empire of Silence. I don't know if that's because it is better or if it's because it's just new and different, but like that scene specifically, if I were adapting Empire of Silence, I would take that scene from The Murdered Sun as opposed to Empire of Silence, because I think it's more effective in this one. You know, maybe that's just me being weird and thinking of this weird, but like that's how I feel on that. There's also some other stuff missing throughout the book and the Delos section that, you know, like I kind of mentioned, that Christopher mentions in the introduction to this Anderida book's version of the publication. That means escaping the planet and other stuff like that come about differently as well, but even some of that was pretty fun. And I should also mention, specifically where escaping the planet is concerned, there's some pretty huge Mos Eisley Cantina from Star Wars Episode 4 vibes in one specific scene in the Delos section of The Murdered Sun that I just adored, and I thought that that was really fun. As for Act 2, the introduction of Emish, incredibly different. Rather than roaming the streets and entering Colosso, Hadrian is a slave working in the fields in The Murdered Sun, and that kind of changes the trajectory of parts of the story and allows for it to be much shorter than it currently is. You're able to explore a lot of cool stuff this way, and has some familiar philosophical material in it, but it also mentions some darker material than I think Empire of Silence ever did, which I thought was interesting. It's also very short, this second act. Not enough room to breathe. Like I said before, I would have preferred a little bit more character stuff there. If, you know, I were the editor, I would have asked for that second act to be expanded. Maybe not necessarily in the way that it was expanded in Empire of Silence, like with the Name of the Wind homeless arc type of thing, but, you know, it would have been cool to see it a little bit more expanded as well. As for the Act 3 of The Murdered Sun, the whole back half of the book, like I said, this basically combines Acts 3 and the climax and everything of Empire of Silence, just kind of intermixed and plotted a little bit strangely. Coming out of the slave life and being part of the royalty's life is where this is all all happens, but then the climax also happens kind of like throughout, where most of what you remember from the climax of Empire of Silence, that whole last 150 pages with like the interrogation, the crash landing, the confrontation, all that kind of stuff, that happens in like bits and pieces throughout the intermixing with royalty section. So like I said, there's a little bit of strange pacing or plotting here, but it was fascinating to read about anyway. Again, there are some things missing here, but a lot of the bigger threads are still here and exist in their own way. And one that I praised earlier, one plot point was probably the most fun I had with the entirety of The Murdered Sun, because of how things played out differently, but also the exact same between The Murdered Sun and Empire of Silence, and that made it worth it, because it was so unexpected and cool. And then this third act is also a tad slow here versus Empire of Silence, because in Empire of Silence they're more like two distinct acts. You have that slower section, and then you have the climax and everything through the end, which is just breakneck pace, whereas this one kind of spreads that out a little bit. There's nothing really actually ugly in the story, except that it does mention some darker topics than I think Empire of Silence ever did, like I mentioned, but you know, just commenting on how fun it was to read structurally as a huge fan of Sun Eater was really fun to talk about. But that does lead me finally into the recommendation. Everybody who loves Sun Eater, but especially the people who really love Empire of Silence, needs to read The Murdered Sun, in my opinion. It's not necessary. It's not strictly necessary, but I do think it is totally worth doing. And since we are speaking of the Anderida books collection, the version of the book that will be sold pretty soon. I don't know if Christopher is going to self-pub a version of it. I hope he does. I think he definitely should, so that the people who want to read it don't have to find a way to get the Anderida version, or, you know, join the Patreon and just wait until it's all done, because that'll take a little while. The Anderida version does include The Prince of Man, a short story at the end of it. Yes, like, read this. Like, if you can get a hold of this short story sooner than later, I think you should. It will come, I believe, in Tales of the Sun Eater Volume 4 next year. I'm not 100% sure. Future Casey here. Since the time that I recorded this review, it has come to my attention that this story will be in Tales of the Sun Eater Volume 4, so you need not worry about having to acquire some special edition to be able to read this story. Just wanted to make that clear, since I didn't know that at the time that I recorded this review. this story is super worth reading. So like, this is kind of a side tangent point, preferably after you've read everything else concurrently written in the Sun Eater series. You'll have a huge appreciation for the referenced material in The Prince of Man as another apocryphal take on Hadrian Marlowe. It's genuinely super, super good. Like, I think the second most fun story that I've ever read from Christopher is The Prince of Man, and if you're asking why only the second, it's because the number one most fun I've ever had with one of Christopher's stories I'm actually not allowed to talk about right now. It's just so fun, it is so cool, and also funny. It's definitely worth reading as a huge fan of the series. The tonal and the thematic upheaval done on account of the context of the rest of the series published made it incredibly hilarious. I laughed out loud several times reading The Prince of Man, and I did not think Christopher would be an author that would manage to get me to laugh out loud because of like genuinely funny stuff. So like, yeah, it was really, really cool. But hey, that is the review of The Murdered Sun and also The Prince of Man, very briefly, by Christopher Ruocchio. If you can get the Anderida edition, please read it. If you manage to have it, if you have the rights to one of the numbers or something and you get an edition of it, please make a point to read it as soon as you can if you are a big fan of the series, because yeah, it is genuinely really good. If you can't get the Anderida edition, like I mentioned, follow along with the serialized chapter releases on Christopher's Patreon. It's still a decent bit of the way from finishing, but it is over halfway through, so you can get a good chunk of the story if you want to. But yeah, I have mentioned to him at least once, and I do plan to talk to him a little bit more about it, that after the Patreon serialization is complete, at the very least, after that point, he should 100% publish an EPUB, an ebook version of The Murdered Sun, or, you know, make another print version if you wanted to, but at least make some sort of version that people can get without having to jump through the Patreon hoops just to be able to read it, and also don't have to, you know, try to get one of Anderida's versions, because that would be very difficult and expensive, and because it's a limited edition. So basically, if you can get a hold of The Murdered Sun in some way and you're a big fan of Sun Eater, you should read it. That is the gist of the review. Thank you for watching this video. If you did, I'll be back. I don't actually know when. This next week will be my next reading wrap-up and TBR video, it looks like, according to my schedule. So if you're interested in that kind of thing, I hope you stick around for it. Thank you again for watching. I'll be back in the next video regardless.